All right. Guess I will probably share this for right now. Okay, so I think that is now we're streaming. Mute myself. All right. Oh yeah, I need to record on the thing.
Don't forget to smash that subscribe button.
That's how you say it. Bobby has the experience there. All right. So let me get the link and then. All right. So real quick before I pass it over to Ben. If you have a question for Joshua, you're welcome to answer it here using the Q&A on Zoom, or we will be monitoring the YouTube chat as well. So if you have a question for us or Joshua, you have two places there you can ask it. Highly encourage you to follow along with the presentation. And thank you again for joining us. And if you check the Q&A link, the Q&A tab in Zoom, there is the YouTube link. So go ahead, Ben. I think we are good to go.
Cool. All right. Welcome everybody to the 23rd Merge PHP, to the best supergroup since Cream, hopefully, right? We have a bunch of user groups here together. Really just want to join together during COVID to give you a cool experience, and we're hoping to keep this going for quite a while, just to give us all a place to meet virtually. Personally, I've been pretty excited to have this since I have no local meetup and really no local community that I could start a meetup with, and it's been really nice and really fun for me. So thank you all for joining. Tonight we have Joshua Copeland here with us to tell us about becoming a bug exterminator. I met Joshua fairly recently at Longhorn PHP down in Austin, and he's a great guy. Really excited to have you here tonight, Joshua, and excited for everyone to hear this talk. So I hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ben. That was a lot of fun at Longhorn. It was I was getting cabin fever being in the house from this pandemic, so it's nice that those are starting. But I appreciate Merge PHP having me. This is an honor, especially with the amount of brain power on this Zoom call is probably enough to start the singularity. So I appreciate any questions or anything that comes up during the slides. Feel free to drop something in the chat. I will try to keep an eye on it. If for some reason I miss something, one of the hosts, if you could bug me, that's fine too. I will take no offense to that. So let me share. Can everybody see my screen now?
Yep.
Yeah, cool. All right. So this is a talk that I started in 2017. So it has evolved quite a bit over the years. Just all in all, this is a cumulative amount of information I've learned from other great talks from people like Colin Odell and other great developers, and added kind of my experience and war stories onto it, if you will. Is it just me or is it backwards?
Looks all right for me.
Is it? Okay.
Yep, looks good.
Okay. Sorry. For some reason on my Zoom, it's like mirrored. So whatever. Okay. So cool. Without further ado, we'll jump into it. So if anybody wants to reach me, my email, josh@remote-dev-force. Probably can't see it because my little thing there. And if you want to follow me, I'm at OG Programmer. If you're curious how I got the name, vice president of sales at a large company, saw me doing a little rap routine at a Christmas party and gave me that name. So And that was my dog. I recently got a puppy, and that's been a lot of fun, aka chewing up all my wires underneath my desk. So quickly, just about me, I'm Josh Copeland. I think I said that already. I am CTO of Remote Dev Force. It's a company I started about 4 years ago. Just been doing software so long that I've just had a lot of connections to go freelance, and I've loved it ever since. I've had 12 years of PHP development. Love PHP. All the haters out there can, go bye-bye. I think it's still one of the strongest languages out there for especially new people jumping into programming. 15 years of cumulative software development experience, just been through the ringer on all kinds of languages and stuff. So hate using the word full stack, but been around the block. Done many startups. Many have failed, a few have succeeded. So I love the startup mentality. I'm a family man. You can probably hear my 2 kids in the background. I love tech, and I like to skateboard when I have time. And I recently got into jiu-jitsu, which is a lot of fun, getting choked out doing that. So an overview basically of this talk. What we're going to talk about is basically, debugging in general. And more specifically, we'll dive into Xdebug itself for PHP and how to set up Xdebug. Some of the slides may be slightly off here, but the good thing at the end, I will go through a demo on how to actually set this up with PHP Storm or IntelliJ or whatever. I know they're probably a sponsor, JetBrains. Shout out to them. They make awesome IDEs. I will show how to set that up. We'll show some kind of advanced features as well as just basic features on how to debug in there at the end. During the talk, we'll also cover just tools and best practices for finding bugs. I'll dive into a few war stories if we have time. And like I mentioned, we'll go through some of the examples. I have a GitHub repo out there that might be helpful for some people struggling to get Xdebug set up. So debugging in you. The number one thing I think number one mistake I made when I started doing development is I would get into this, that spinning your wheels moment where you're just kind of so lost that you end up blaming it on ghosts. So you're like, I have no idea what's going on. There's a phantom bit being flipped by the moon's gravity or something. That's not the reality, right? There is a reason why that bug is happening. Most of the time it's on some remote environment. Maybe you can't replicate it locally. There is a way to get that data. So you have to be data driven when you're actually doing debugging. Don't make any assumptions. So, understand the issue. That's reading docs and things like that, really diving into the nitty gritty on whatever technology you're using that's causing issues. And refuse to accept like magic or ghosts as the answer, especially from your team too. You should demand, to figure out exactly what's going on for something very important that's cratering your system or something. Restarting the service sometimes isn't an acceptable answer. Reading other developers' code is a great way also to just understand what good code looks like in open source software projects like Laravel, Symfony. It's great ways to learn, how good developers structure code, how you should probably structure code, writing tests, things like that. It's just mirroring what, the giants before us have done and building on top of that. So let's see. The next thing is just defensive programming. Setting up traps for bugs is mainly what that means. So the first line of defense here is you as the developer. When you create bugs, you can fix them by doing, perhaps better type hinting or better logging. There are other ways that you can capture more data to figure out exactly what's going on. So, just try to use we'll dive into more specifics here, but being a defensive programmer helps you avoid bugs before they even start. There are a lot of things with defensive programming that kind of are under that. There's catching exceptions, not just catching /exception, but actually specific exceptions. Maybe there's a particular case like a guzzle timeout. Let's try the call again. I've seen the case made for that. So there are cases where you can do that. Also, type hinting, like I mentioned, with PHP 7's advent of type hinting, there should be no reason you shouldn't start using it. You don't have to flip the strict mode on yet, but start using that. Just readability is much better, especially with 8. I almost feel like we're getting to the point to where we almost don't need any PHP doc annotations above a function or method, because it's self-explanatory what variables are accepted and things like that. If you type hint things very well, maybe you just need a string that explains what's happening in there. Writing tests is super important. I've heard TDD, all this other stuff. I don't care. At the end of the day, as long as you've got automated tests that are either unit or integration tests that cover your feature, that is awesome. Whether you do it before or after you write your code, whatever, as long as you have the tests there, it prevents a future developer from breaking your feature, but also understanding your feature too and testing it if they have to change something in there. I'm sure we've all been there where we had to go change something and there's no tests and it's somebody else's code and we're kind of lost as to whether it's still working. And there are many SaaS tools out there for collecting logs, just doing like QA stuff, whether it be Browser Stack and the plethora of different logging solutions out there. There are ways that you can set this stuff up. So that way, not just some, DevOps king in their tower having access, but the whole team has access to the logs and can understand, if there's an issue out there. Sentry is a great one that I've used a lot, and I love their product. So that's a good one to take a look at if you're just starting like a simple project and want some simple alerting if production's breaking or whatnot. So some of the other things, just using various log levels. Don't be afraid to drop debug level logs. On production, you may not be logging those, but if something is happening on production, all you have to do is maybe change the log level or, maybe increase the log level, but that could be dangerous if you have a lot of debug logs. But case being, on your local, you can see those debug logs and better understand exactly what's going on. So comments and documentation, those are also things that, really help another developer coming along understand the code, figuring out how to set up alerts, monitoring, and using observability to dive into the code better when it's running on production and understanding what your traffic levels look like, exceptions and things like that, errors, sumo log, and there's a lot of other great ones out there, and you can roll your own as well. And just one of the cool features even with Sentry is you can actually have, like, if there's a 500 page that happens, a form will pop up, and on the form it just says, hey, something bad happened, can you tell us what you did? That's been helpful. I've gotten some Sentry errors where the user explains, hey, I clicked on this and put this, and then, I got this 500. Well, they don't say 500, but hey, it didn't work. It's broke. So I'm seeing like some things about people seeing me and Tim. Is the stream okay, or is that just a one-off occurrence?
Yeah, just some Zoom stuff going on. I think it's fixed.
Okay. Cool. All right. So what does the bug fixing process look like? Well, it becomes second nature as you kind of do this more, as you, with anything, practice, you will get better. So think logically, again, use data, track down the issues that are occurring. So once you identify the issue, that will then give you a way that, okay, I can add this fix. There may be a quick fix that adds technical debt, or there's a right way to fix it that you'd have to re-engineer the whole world. Whatever path you may go, you may want to document, we should do this, but for now, we're going to do this quick thing that's, going to perhaps add technical debt, but you want to avoid that as much as possible, because most of the time you'll add the quick fix and then that's what lives out in production for the rest of eternity. So process typically for debugging, gather data, look at the exception, what user, what page, figure out what's going on, and then try to replicate that issue on some lower environment, whether it's a staging environment, a QA environment, or your local environment. Try to replicate that issue. Sometimes that's not as easy, it's easier said than done if live is very complicated versus your lower environments, but those are good cases that you should have better data on your lower environments. And again, if you can provide a more stable production system by telling the business, hey, we need to spend some time adding good fixture data on our local environments to prevent live from breaking, I'm sure most businesses would be more than happy for you to spend that time so they're not down and losing money. Understand the issue. Once you replicate it, figure out why that happens. That will then give you ideas to actually fix it. And again, the asterisk, try to fix it without adding technical debt. So, there's typically there's mostly like a wrong way and or I should say a quick way and a right way of doing it. Talk to your team. Don't be afraid to just like, oh, I'm going to isolate this fix and get it out. Discuss the pros and cons of both approaches, or maybe multiple approaches, and get other ideas, and go from there. And then the final thing, write a test. Whatever broke, write a test so that doesn't happen again. I know there's a lot of projects out there that don't have tests, and it is what it is, but if at bare minimum you had feature tests that just checked, hey, I can log in, add something to a cart and check out, that typically just covering what does our business do to make money with a test is a bare minimum I would recommend to any business. That way they know that at least a core business is working. So programming, this is a bit of a meme, but most of your time is going to be spent hunting bugs, bad queries, optimizing code. Don't get frustrated. It takes a while to do this stuff. Sometimes you may start to spin your wheels and feel like you aren't making progress, but take a break, try another approach, different searches for your error, try to copy different things. Again, don't take like Stack Overflow for like, the gold standard here. Go read the docs, understand what your fix is going to do. And with, again, the debugger, you'll be able to step through the code, whether it be by running a test case and stepping through it, or just doing a typical request or whatever, and debug through the variables and understand exactly what's going on here. So typically what the stages of debugging for a developer is, oh, this can't happen. That doesn't happen on my machine, which if you say this doesn't work on my box, you get that little award there. In fact, we had an award at one of my teams, and there's a few developers that said that, and they would earn that award and keep it until the next person said it. Again, you can replicate this stuff most of the time. Again, and yes, it may be on a remote environment, but there's a way to replicate it. Then they go to this shouldn't happen. Why does that happen? Oh, I see how that happens. How did this code ever work? So those 6 stages, every developer has gone through. Releasing to production may feel a bit like, this Indiana Jones clip here, where the minute you go to push code, you're nervous a giant boulder is going to come behind you and crush you, right? Releasing to production shouldn't be that nerve-wracking. You need lower environments. You need a dev environment. With Docker and all this other great stuff nowadays, it's fairly easy to get something set up locally. So if you are in the rare predicament where you only have a production server, or not using Get, maybe you're still FTPing up files, you need to invest time to do things right. So I think everyone has been there before in the past, but back in the day that was normal, and now things have changed and there are much better ways to building your code and releasing to an RC environment, testing there first. Okay, it works. Now go to production. So there have been cases where something did work on my local, and the minute we went to production, it didn't. Famously, I think some people I'm sure have ran into is sessions. Sessions on one box is fine, but the minute you go to a load balanced environment with 10 servers, if you have sessions stored locally, all of a sudden you're getting logged out every other request. So, there are certain cases where remote environments, you're going to run into things that you didn't on your local, but that's where I would, say, try to get an RC or a staging environment that looks close to your production setup. With Terraform and other great technologies out nowadays, it's fairly, easy. I'd say easy with a grain of salt here, but it's possible to have a Terraform file that builds your RC and builds your production, and you simply just pass in a few variables to change the instance size or how many servers, things like that. So you don't need a beefy RC server, but you want a ton of servers out on production, but you still have a load balanced RC server to test things like session storage or whatnot. So now diving into Xdebug. Basically, Xdebug is a PHP extension. It allows for you to not only debug your code, but to also profile your code. So on xdebug.org, you can take a look at all the great documentation there. It is obviously an open source project too. So feel free to take a look at the source. But underneath the hood, Xdebug uses the DBGP protocol, which I think some other languages use as well. It's basically just a protocol for this, stepping through code sort of thing. It was created in 2002 by Mr. Derek Revens. So pay him some respect if you have solved a major bug with Xdebug by going over to his Amazon wish list and buying him some whiskey. He's made massive contributions to the PHP community, as well as he runs a podcast dedicated to PHP internals. So shout out to him. He's saved a lot of production environments, I'm sure. So why use Xdebug, right? Like, this is such a common thing when you're starting out programming is, you maybe try to set it up, just doesn't work. And you're like, I'm spending too much time trying to figure this out. Let me just fall back to my old ways. So you go and you echo or print something out on the screen, or you're var dumping some object, or you're dropping error logs in the log file, or worse yet, you're creating some variable for specifically debugging that you might forget to remove, and it sits in your PR and somebody makes a comment, what is this? In fact, I've done that a few times by actually adding the Xdebug start flag on like a request. I've left that in my PR, and they're like, hey, you left this Xdebug trigger on the URL or whatever. It happens. But anyway, Xdebug itself will get you away from all of this stuff, because in the end, setting it up, yes, may be frustrating, but once you have it set up, you're going to be twice as productive, if not more, than you would be trying to do this old school style of dropping logs or var dumping things to the screen. There's just much easier ways of doing this with Xdebug by actually stepping through your code in real time. Xdebug has a lot of great features. Like I mentioned, you can take a look at what's in a variable, and if it's an object, inspect all the parameters on it, changing all the values on the fly. If for some reason a certain edge case happens when this value equals 1 instead of 0, you can actually change that value when you're in a breakpoint to something else, which, I've not necessarily used that before, but it's there. And I can see the use case for that. Breakpoints are great. Again, if the code's breaking on this line, throwing an exception or whatnot, dropping a breakpoint in that try block will typically help you find out exactly what's happening there. And setting up watchers as well lets you take a look exactly at one particular parameter or variable object and watching that throughout the life cycle of the application. And the great thing is you can set this up locally, but you could very well set it up remotely. Not that I recommend setting it up on like you never want to set this up on production, but it's very possible that you could set this up on like a QA environment if you had some issue happening out there that wasn't happening on local and you wanted to step through it. And it also provides application profiling. So this will show you how many times things are getting called, the time it took to execute certain functions. Could expose some areas of your code that are causing, some slowness. And in the end, this is going to save you time versus the kind of old school way that we just talked about of debugging through stuff. So I forgot to update the slide here, but installing Xdebug is fairly straightforward. In my Xdebug examples repo, I do have the updated way of installing Xdebug on a Mac. Potentially, it's pretty much the same for Ubuntu or Debian. You'll just run an install, but I will say Peckle installed Xdebug should work on all platforms. I would always try that first. It seems to be the standard way that we're moving in now, and that's actually what now I do on my Mac. Is yes, I will install PHP with Homebrew, so I'll run Homebrew, install PHP @ 7.4, for example, and then after that's done installing, run Peckle install Xdebug, and then that will go and install the Xdebug extension. There are manual ways of doing it. You could compile it, but you probably don't need to most of the time. Whatever architecture you're on, there's probably a compiled version out there for you. The great thing about Xdebug is pretty much every IDE supports it. Like I mentioned, we'll show how to go through on PHP Storm, but whether you're using VS Code, I'm not sure. Maybe there's some people out there using NetBeans still, but the fact here is you can pretty much use it everywhere. I knew a developer who is a wizard with Vim and had Xdebug set up with Vim, which was quite impressive. So don't be weary of is it going to work sort of thing. Most likely there's a client for whatever IDE you're using. So pretty much the hardest thing about Xdebug is getting Xdebug to connect back to your host machine. So properly setting up and starting your listener and triggering Xdebug to actually start by setting some session variable or like a get parameter and things like that. Those are the two big things that people get hung up on or overlook when they're trying to set up Xdebug locally. So both of which, once you get an understanding of what I'm talking about here, which we'll go over, it'll be much easier for understand how Xdebug communicates with your IDE to actually step through your code. So between the server and client, that's where that DBGP protocol starts to send information back and forth, and how your IDE is able to show you, where it's breakpointed and all that fun stuff. So just for a visual, on the left, we have our host machine, and we've got, let's say, JetBrains, a PHP Storm running in there. And out on the right-hand side, let's say we're running Docker or, AWS, Vagrant, whatever, some higher environment. We need that server to communicate back to our local host machine. So there basically just needs to be some path for it to communicate back, whether it be something crazy like SSH tunnel for a port or whatever, or just as simple as some configurations for Docker to say, hey, this is the IP address of my box, or setting up some Docker alias that connects back to your native machine. The best and easiest way to get Xdebug connected is if you're using PHP locally, which, by the way, just quick caveat, I've ran into a lot lately, Docker volumes on Mac, and a lot of contention about, how slow it is and things like that. With Symfony projects, I've ran into that significantly with the whole cache rebuild process. So, I have actually, for those particular projects, have started using PHP natively and only using Docker for things like the database, rather than actually having a PHP container and mounting the entire code volume over to Docker. So just a quick caveat about that you could have multiple ways to set up your project on your local. Perhaps on Linux it runs fast, but Mac it doesn't. Maybe try run PHP natively on the Mac. I've seen really good improvement of speed doing that, because you're just dodging the volume mess with Docker. So basically how Xdebug works is you'll make a request over to the server, whether it be on port 80 or 443 or 8080, whatever. You're making a browser request, a HTTP request. And over on the server sees Xdebug session start. That may be in a cookie. It may be in the get parameters. You may even put it in a post body, like the form body. Wherever, Xdebug looks for this value to start the Xdebug process. If you don't have start with request turned on, Xdebug won't know when to start. And if you leave Xdebug running all the time, it could slow down your project, because every time it's executing, Xdebug does take a lot of memory to store all these debug values, all the variable values and things like that. So you'll probably want to set up Xdebug to where it only starts when you tell it to start. So the way that you'll typically do that is just I use a get parameter, which I'll show during the demo at the end here. And once you make that request, Xdebug sees the flag and says, oh, I've got to start. It will then make a connection back to whatever client host is set to. If you have Discover client host turned on, whatever IP address made that request is what it will connect back to. If you hard-coded something for client host, that's what it's going to connect back to. So again, that's where people get tripped up. Docker does some network magic. So if you don't set up an alias back to your native box, or you can just put your IP address of your native machine in there, and typically Xdebug or Docker will be able to reach back out of the container onto your native machine with your IDE running. And your IDE will be listening on port 9000 for this connection. So when this request happens back from the server, your IDE goes, oh, hey, we've got a debug request coming in. And then that's when that connection is made. And that's when info starts getting sent about what line of code it's on, the variable values, and all that great stuff. And your IDE will typically do a good job about showing you all of that information. Then you'll spend your time debugging, finding all those bugs, and squashing them. So to start Xdebug, you can either install a browser extension. There are different ones out there. They all essentially do the same thing. They'll most likely set this xdebug_session cookie. And in there, it will perhaps have a IDE key, which I'll explain here in a second. The other way you can start Xdebug is you could add a get parameter at the end of your URL. So for example, localhost index.php, we can add a question mark to throw on a get parameter. And you can put xdebug_session_start equals then the IDE key, or your, AKA your session name. The reason that key is important is typically you'll want to set up your IDE to listen for that key specifically. So you could potentially have multiple, if there were a case where you had an edge case where two requests happening at the same time caused an issue, you could potentially set up two different sessions and debug two different sessions at the same time to try to recreate that. So the other way is you just set up Xdebug to always start on request. So again, every time you make a request to the browser, boom, it immediately tries to connect back on port 9003. Caveat, legacy Xdebug was port 9000, but they changed that to 9003 because I believe FPM and other things probably clash with the usage of port 9000. Like I mentioned, if you want, just Google this stuff, but Xdebug Chrome extension, Safari, Firefox, Opera. I will share these links here. In fact, in my GitHub for the Xdebug examples, there is a link to these slides there. And you can click these for the ones I recommend for that. I'm not sure who's using Opera, but I have used Opera because there have been some weird things that Opera does that other browsers don't do. So once you get that installed, typically you'll just need to click it and boom, it'll start putting that Xdebug start variable into your cookie. There are various modes that Xdebug now has. That actually should be a lowercase d in Xdebug. But typically you'll want to set up the develop and debug. Perhaps if you want to do profiling, you can set up profiling. You can, it's not like you have to stay in one mode here. You just need to have a comma separated value for these modes when you put it into your PHP INI or wherever. You can turn on different ones. So if you want just debugging, you can do that. If you want just profiling, you can do that. In my example, I have a example usage of how to do this with the built-in PHP web server. So we'll try to cover that here at the end. It's essentially this xdebug_mode is what you can set to turn these things on and off.
Hey Joshua, can you move your picture of your face to the upper right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't. Yeah, that's great.
There we go. Yeah,
Thanks.
a little smile there. Cool. Yeah, thanks for that. Shoot. All right. So let's see here. There are some other configs obviously out there for Xdebug that are super helpful. Things like there's like a scream mode where perhaps people put an @ in front of something that echoed out a deprecation or some sort of log. which don't ever use @ to suppress errors, but it was there in PHP. You can actually have Xdebug still output those errors or notices or whatever it may be. So there's a lot of other great features with Xdebug other than just the ones I'm skimming over here. But you can always take a look at the documentation for more advanced usage on it. So to enable Xdebug, if you're going from 2 to 3, typically your Xdebug version 2 config will look something like this. You have your remote enable, which is just saying, hey, we're going to connect back out on whatever host. And with V3, all of that is now replaced with this one simple line. So V3 did a great job at consolidating a lot of the configurations for Xdebug. So I would recommend going with 3. And it's probably not a huge reason to be using 2 unless maybe you're on some old version of PHP, which I'm kind of dealing with right now on one client. So yeah, just take a look at version 3 and the documentation is really great for that. And like I mentioned, the ports have changed. Also, there were some other things like coverage enabled, default enabled. Those are now Xdebug mode coverage or mode develop. So if you have some Xdebug configuration that you're trying to migrate over, just take those into consideration and convert those over. Again, this is pulled from the docs from Xdebug.org. So you can look this stuff up later, but one of the big ones here is remote connect back. You'll want to replace that with discover client hosts. That may trip people up. Remote auto start, you'll want to convert that with start with request and the debug mode. And the remote host is now called client host. So that client host is where you'll be putting the IP address of your machine that you want to debug on. That way it knows what to make that request out on. So Xdebug also has this remote mode here. And basically you can now use the Xdebug mode debug with the start with request trigger. And that basically will allow you to, like I was mentioning earlier with the Chrome extension or just putting it in the get parameter, you can then just trigger Xdebug when to start rather than it having to run all the time. So typical Docker configuration might look something like this. You'll have a Xdebug INI, stuffed somewhere where PHP can pick up on it. So for this example, user localhost, etc, PHP confd, and then some Xdebug INI file. And in there, you'll be enabling the Xdebug extension. And then, you'll have developer debug modes. Those are kind of the 2 big ones that you'll want probably turned on. And the client host. So in Docker, again, you just need this. This is the most important line, because if you don't have this, it's going to attempt to make a request on the IP address that made the request, and that will not make it back to your local machine due to Docker network magic. So if you use this host.docker.internal, I believe now Docker actually added support to have that as a host name to reach back out to the host machine. So if you just set client host to that host name, you should be all set. It should be able to make a request back. And start with request. If you have that on, which I would suggest, you have to add the trigger to turn on Xdebug in order to have it actually kick off. Well, I take that back. Yes means it's going to always be on, and then trigger means you have to send that value to trigger Xdebug. So a couple of other configs, and then we'll move on. Discover client host. Again, that's what I mentioned. It will make a guess at, hey, this IP address contacted me, and then it'll try to make a request back out on that, but you can override that and hard code it with the client host setting. And if you're just not able to get this working and you are so lost as to why Xdebug cannot communicate with your IDE, and I've used this before, use the Xdebug log. So you can debug your debugger. It's like an inception way of debugging, but essentially it will tell you what happened when it attempted to connect back out on whatever IP address on that port 9003, and whether the connection was made, if the host was found, etc. This is a really great way of debugging the debugger. So if you are using 2, take a look at the upgrade guide to 3. And if you want a more advanced view of all of the settings that Xdebug provides, go to the docs, all settings. There are some functions that Xdebug provides, albeit I haven't necessarily used them, but you could actually drop in some PHP functions to drop a breakpoint, show memory usage, even do timing sort of things, which take with a grain of salt because you're running Xdebug, which slows your application slightly. So those, when you're doing like a timing index to see how long it takes to do some process, that may be slightly off, but it's there. You can do stack traces as well. So you can actually have it echo out onto the screen what happened if there was like an exception thrown or something like that. There are some ways that you can flip this on. As I mentioned, you could use this for time indexing, as well as just probably the built-in time function with PHP. But this you could potentially see, okay, how long did this chunk of code take? And one of the great features, aside from debugging, that Xdebug provides is just the profiler. So what will happen is if you enable the profiler, wherever you set your profiler output directory, once a process is done, a cache grind file will get put into that directory. Then with some cache grind reader, you can view that cache grind file to actually see what happened during the life cycle of that request. Again, this could be helpful for certain methods that maybe are getting called too much, spinning out of control, taking too long. This is a great way for you to quickly see what's perhaps being a little slow in your application. There are other profilers out there, Blackfire, etc. But that is there available for you if you want to quickly use that. Yeah, Xdebug does get automatically turned off by Composer. If for whatever reason you were doing development on Composer, there are ways that you can actually still turn Xdebug back on, but just know that, because back in the day, Xdebug would be on and Composer would run, and then Composer would run out of memory because Xdebug is trying to keep track of everything Composer is doing. Setting up PHP Storm is fairly simple. If you are using a native PHP built-in web server, like the development server, it should be as easy as just perhaps turning on the phone icon, unless you've got some, again, multiple browser sessions you want to debug at the same time. But another great way to set it up is just by using what's called the PHP remote server value. I'll show that here at the end, but essentially what that allows you to do is say, here's the ID key I want to listen to. But more importantly, out on your remote server, the code is going to most likely live in a different directory than your local. So another thing that trips people up is if they do debug on a remote environment, even whether it's Docker, it may live in slash data slash my website, but on your local machine, it's in user, my username, and projects or something like that. You need to add what's called a class path map setting in order to map the remote directory to your local directory. I'll show you guys where that's at, because that could be tricky too if you don't have that set up. Xdebug will start, your PHP Storm instance will start debugging, but it says, hey, I have no idea where this file is. So you just need to map those things over. And you can debug JavaScript as well in PHP Storm. So it's all in all, if you're not using debuggers, try and check it out. So this is what the screen looks like if you don't have class path map settings turned on, and they'll have a little link here you can click to map that over. So you can see here it says remote file path is in applications and some long directory, but on my local server, it's probably not there. So that's where you can click that link there and actually map those directories over. So then it can start stepping through whatever file it hit on the remote on your local. Going through just some of the screens of the debugger itself. The first here on the left is where you'll see some simple commands to either start the debug process, to kill the debug process with the stop button there. You could perhaps restart the Xdebug process with that little green loop the arrow there at the top. And there's also the breakpoints that you can either toggle on or off, which is helpful. So if you set breakpoints all over the place, you can click that and quickly see where all those breakpoints are set up and turn some of them off or turn them all off, or quickly hop over to that line using that menu on the left there. The number 2 part of this is the frames. That'll show you your stack trace. So as it dives deeper into different files, that will stack different files on top of each other as those methods are getting called. And the variables pane here has all of the variables within the scope of whatever file you're currently looking at. And the watchers on the right is whatever you've set up to watch particular variables. So if there's one variable that's causing you pain, you can add that to the watcher and see what that value is at all times versus having to dig through the variables pane to always find that value. At the top is a few different ways to step through. You can either step over, step into a method. Step over would just skip going into the method and just hop to the next line below that. You can hop out of a method that you're currently in. So there's different ways to go in and out of code here. And then the 5th is just the debug console that shows you the kind of, network communication between Xdebug. So multiple sessions, again, like I mentioned, it may be useful for setting up in special cases where you have like more than one request. You can do that. JavaScript debugging, you can set up. You'll just need to set up the which browser to use. Then you can hit play and it'll launch the browser and attempt to make a connection between the browser and the IDE. So it actually will start stepping through the code there. But you have to install the JetBrains Chrome extension for that to actually work. So it's great. Let's say you've got all your code ready to go. You think it's the best stuff code in the world. It's tested and all this great stuff, and you go to release it. So is your code going to be the best code that's ever been released to production? Or is that code going to be your full moon and is going to turn into your worst nightmare? So again, if your code does something terrible out on production, don't use the excuse works on my box. Immediately start digging into the why. So try to replicate that. Use a debugger. With complex applications, this is the key to understanding why a certain value changes in a bad way and better understanding what your application's doing. So again, this stuff is hard, but if you spend some time and practice at debugging, you too can become a bug exterminator. So again, just get it set up, work through getting it set up. And once you do, you're going to thank yourself 1,000 times versus trying to do things the old school way. And again, don't be afraid, to ask for help or whatever if you do run into issues with that, or use the xdebug log to figure out what's going on there. So just to cover some of the old school things, as well as some helpful things in some of the frameworks that are out there. For example, Symfony. In Twig, you could use the dump function to actually dump out what's happening with a particular Twig value or whatnot that's in there. That could be very helpful and may not be very easy to step through the code. There are certain cases where cache files are getting hit or other things where you're just not going to be able to actually step through the code, like in that template, for example. So you may want to use something like dump if that's the case. Laravel has like the DD, which basically kind of like, dumps the values. WordPress has like a WP debug environment variable you can set. And as well as Drupal, Joomla, they have their own kind of little debug things you can turn on. So xdebug is not the end all be all per se. So if there are functions that will help you in whatever framework you're using to debug your issue, take a look at it. So let's say your team added a whole bunch of code and you have no idea what in that code actually broke production or whatever. So this is where get comes in really handy. So digging through the get logs and seeing where it worked and where it quit working is super helpful. That will then kind of give you, okay, this commit is what started the issue. So if you use the divide and conquer method to kind of step through, okay, let's start at commit 14, for example, here, right in the middle, and kind of bouncing back and forth until we isolate that commit that actually broke the system. That will help you then dive into what changed in that particular commit that broke whatever. And again, when something breaks, go and add a test so it doesn't break again in the future. Writing feature and unit tests for all your new code is key to making sure you have a stable system. So always when you're making something public too, think about the repercussions of that, because the minute you make a function public on a class, you're making a contract with the entire world that this is my method, these are the variables I accept, and these are perhaps the exceptions that can get thrown here. So those are the things you want tested. By design, by testing your public methods, in theory, should test all of your protected and private methods underneath. So just try to cover all of your public methods, and that's a good way to write your unit tests. So as you write tests, you may think of edge cases or even write a test that causes an issue that then you can go back and maybe add some better type hinting or different things to better your code. And in the end, leverage things like CI, continuous integration, GitHub Actions, GitLab's pipelines. There are a ton of different tools out there, Circle CI, whatever it is. Have something that automatically runs before you make that merge or push. That way you know the system's still working. Again, that ensures that you have a stable system, and down the road when other developers work on it, they know that they didn't break the entire world. So I'll just quickly explain the differences between an edge case, a boundary case, and a corner case. So I have an example here where we have a speaker. So on the speaker, there are two knobs. One's called volume. The volume goes from 0 to 100. And then we have another speaker we have another value that's called bass that's also on the speaker. So an edge case are basically if volume equals 0 or 100, that's the edge, if you will, of that value. And that is considered basically an edge case. So a boundary case is when that value perhaps goes over or slightly under that edge. So that would be a boundary case. So -1, 0 would be your edge case. And then 1 again would be the boundary case there. In a corner case, now we introduce that second parameter I talked about, base. Corner cases is multiple edges. So again, we have two variables that conflict with each other somehow. That's a corner case. Using logs and commenting are probably the best way to understand why production is breaking or whatnot. That is going to tell you Stripe is down, like timed out. Okay, let's go take a look at the status page. Yeah, it is down. Okay, it's not us. So if you didn't have logging, you'd be like flying blind, and that's not a good way to have your production environment set up. You should have ways of capturing those errors, whether it be roll bar or some other method. Just jumping on the server and looking at logs is fine if you're like a one-man team. But if you're more than one, you probably want something like Sumo or roll bar. There's a ton of other logging capture things out there, even just CloudTrail or whatever. You can take a look at what's exactly happening out on that system and understand better what's happening. And then that gives you the data to then replicate it on your local. This little comment here, dear maintainer, please don't try optimizing this code. Every time you try to refactor it, add how many hours you wasted to this value below. I've seen that before. Again, this is just, it's kind of funny, but leave good comments, right? Try to tell people what something's doing. Being over verbose with your comments isn't necessarily a bad thing. If the code, you can read it and understand what's happening and your variables are named good, then you probably don't need a comment. But if the minute something complicated is happening, add a comment. Graylog is a great open source way of kind of setting up your own logger, so you don't have to pay some SaaS, thing. But there are other ways to kind of set that stuff up too. So if you want to pay for something, there's LogRocket and other providers out there. Catching specific exceptions, again, maybe you want to retry when we make an HTTP call. If there's a timeout, we could handle that differently. So this is like a guzzle example here, where we're catching particular exceptions depending on what actually, what error occurred. So at the end, you're still going to catch your generic. And then, we'll have our timeout or connection exception. We could do something slightly different there, or maybe we retry or we log some different information there. Versus if the request blew up, then the way that we're putting the request together is bad. So separating, did the server break or did our client break? Those are good examples of how to actually properly catch particular exceptions. But in the end, you can catch a throwable or exception and log what happened there. Again, just try to drop a log, even if it's a debug level log, you'll have something later. but just try to avoid a single gotta catch 'em all Pokemon exception. Another kind of more recent trend I've seen is in an application, sending data to SaaS products like Segment, or even rolling your own kind of event timeline system. But essentially, let's say when a user signs up, you want to know, maybe the IP address or whatever information about them. You want to send that event data off to like Braze to shoot an automated marketing email off to them or whatever. Using something like Segment, you can send a UDP packet event like, hey, here's the event data. Go ahead and store that. And Segment collects all this data. That's what's happening out in the system. You can make all your own events when a user signs up, when a user purchases something. And then in some other environment or some other system, like some marketing tool, they can go and connect to Segment and pull whatever events. So that way you don't have to go actually change your production code to integrate some marketing tool or anything like that. You can just have this event-based system, if you will, be the source of truth for whatever the heck marketing wants to do and plug into. So albeit necessarily debug related, you could potentially use this event information to find out issues though. So it's nice to have more data than not enough data. There are some debug toolbars out there, depending on the framework you're using. Symfony has a great one, Laravel as well. Those debug toolbars provide you a lot of information. So you'll see how long the request took, if an error was thrown, where it happened. Go ahead and use those. Those are great tools for debugging. Z-Ray is also an option too, and has its own toolbar. So you could set that up for if you have like some framework you built in-house or something, you can still kind of add your own introspecting kind of tool here for a debug toolbar. Observability is a big topic nowadays, and really that means having good monitoring with graphs, with alerting. So take a look at things like Kibana, Elk Stack more particularly, which combines, Elasticache, Kibana, and these different technologies to collect all of the metrics and then present them to you in Kibana's like graphing dashboard, as you can see here on the bottom right. It's super nice to be able to see, okay, we made a release. Let's draw a line on the graph. Oh, the minute we did the release and that line showed up on the graph, all the errors started shooting through the roof. So it gives you an easy way to know if a release caused an issue. And all in all, it gives you insight into your production system instead of having to kind of manually dig through Apache logs or whatever. Nagios and Opsgenie are great tools for sending emails or PagerDuty as well, making a phone call, sending a text message, having basically ways of saying, okay, contact the developer or support team. If they don't acknowledge the alert, now we start going to higher levels. Oh, like maybe we contact the dev lead, or now we're going to contact the architect or maybe even the client and tell them, hey, the site's down or whatever. So you can basically, if a developer acknowledged it, those higher levels wouldn't get notified because the developer is working on a fix or whatever. New Relic, just to throw it out there, albeit expensive, it is a good option to have decent graphs and things like that out of the box if you don't want to roll your own. Yeah, and just that's the K and Elk is Kibana, which is that graphing library. Console tools are underrated. If you're not comfortable with the console, I suggest, experiment and get comfortable with it. There are a lot of great commands built into Symfony and Laravel that will give you a lot of great debugging information. So, for example, Bing Console Debug Router shows you all the routes that Symfony, your project, has available to the world. Laravel, same thing. You can use artisan routes and see all the routes that are possible to communicate with your project. There are a bunch of other great tools too. If you're not familiar, curl, making like a request from the command line, netcat, telnet. Telnet's one that I've used to connect to Redis or Memcache. You can just write telnet, then the IP address of either the Memcache or the Redis host, and then the port for Redis or Memcache. For example, Memcache's ports right here, 11211. And then once you're on there, go read the docs for Redis or Memcache, because all those commands that they have there in the docs work here in Telnet. So you can run get, then the key, and actually see the value that's returned back. Or I believe it's just info. If you run the info command, you'll see how many hits happened, if there were cache misses. It's a great way to say, like, are we actually using cache? Telnet into it, run info, see if the gets and the sets and all those counts look right to you. Obviously, process list, if you're on a Linux machine or Mac, you want to see what's running on your system, PS aux, and then using piping that into grep to look for a particular process. Great way to find processes that are perhaps running on that system. Network map, netstat, some network debugging things you can do. Tail or multi-tail, if you want to tail multiple logs at the same time. Multi-tail is a way of like tailing logs on multiple servers. Siege, that's basically like a way to bench, like Apache bench sort of thing, but basically it just hammers whatever website with requests. So you can try to attempt to like DDoS your own sites with Siege. And then GBD is if you need to get into the nitty gritty underneath the hood, where if PHP core dumps on you and it just says segment faultation and you're like, what just happened? I didn't have any stack trace. You very well may have a core dump sitting somewhere. That core dump is actually like the C information from the binary on like what happened. So you could use this GDB tool to actually look through the core dump file and perhaps get an idea of where in the code that segmentation fault happened. There are other great techniques too. If you're, getting started with programming in general, I'd highly recommend going and following on Twitter. If you're in Symfony, follow Fabian. If you're in Laravel, follow Taylor. You'll get a glimpse as to what's coming in the future, as well as very important information about, for example, like Fabian just mentioned, Flex. A bunch of Flex installs are going to break pretty soon because he's turning off flex.symfony.com, and all of that should now be pointed at GitHub, and a whole bunch of people haven't updated Flex. So, following that, following people that are in the core community are great for keeping, because, development, there's just so much going on. If you don't have a good source of information coming to you, you're just having to kind of like reverse engineer or Google stuff all the time rather than having that information come to you in a passive way. So if you do run into an issue, go to the GitHub project for that. Let's say you're using a dependency and something's breaking in there. See if there's an outstanding issue for that. Most of the time, if you Google something, don't be surprised if you see like a GitHub issue read through it. Sometimes there's like a fix that's somebody posted there, and everybody put rocket emoji on it, and they're like, yeah, this is it, this is a fix, and perhaps you could implement that fix in your project. Take a look at version control, like I mentioned, stepping through and see where it did work and then where it quit working. You can use HTTP, like Postman, fiddlers, things like that, to even PHP Storm has a built-in REST client. So you can actually create your own requests with whatever post values and things like that. Perhaps try to pen test your system or do things that you are not going to necessarily happen in the browser. Blackfire, like I mentioned, you can install that, and that's a good profiling tool. Firebug, JavaScript debugging for Firefox. Fire PHP, it's a Firebug extension for Ajax development. So there's a lot of great tools out there that you can add on top of. Like if you're using React or Vue, there are Chrome extensions or Firefox extensions to add debug information for your React or Vue project and overlay that on the browser, which can be super helpful. And some other kind of profilers, Z-Ray, XHProf, which is made by Facebook. You can profile your system in production potentially with that. If you want to kind of keep an eye on productions, it will every like 100th request create a profile for that request. So then you can kind of take a look at how long things are taking out on production and where your bottlenecks are, which is typically the database. And if you need to get really crazy with maybe man in the middle or some other interesting network related thing, Wireshark is a great way to sniff HTTP traffic, web traffic, TCP traffic, all that kind of stuff. That's kind of like if you go to DEF CON and you back in the past when Twitter allowed you to log in with just HTTP, that's essentially how they were able to look at your username and password you logged in with, as it was not secure. As long as you're on the same network, you can use Wireshark to sniff all of that traffic. Selenium, Sauce Labs, Browser Stack, those are all great ways to do mobile testing. So you can use real iOS, real Android devices and write automated tests for like a mobile app. And also Browser Stack for all the different browsers that are out there. If you've got to support all the way back to, IE6, then that's a great way to kind of use a matrix test, if you will, of all the different browsers that are out there and make sure that, your feature tests can pass. JMeter, Apache Bench, Siege, like I mentioned, you can use for some basic load testing. It's pretty much just going to make web requests. It's not necessarily going to step through and log in and do other stuff. So JMeter, I believe, can do that kind of stuff, but there are probably a bunch of other tools out there that could do that as well. I've even seen people roll their own kind of load testing solutions. And some other great tools out there, MX Toolbox, SSL Checker. SSL Labs has a great rating for your SSL certificate. So it'll, using TLS, kind of check your certificate and give it like an A, B, C, whatever rating, and tell you what's wrong to get a higher rating. So, and if you aren't using Let's Encrypt, I'm a big fan of Let's Encrypt for free SSL certificates. So there should be no reason you should be using HTTP on some higher environment anymore. So check out the online checker tools. I love those, like just looking at, debug, trying to figure out like why my email is not working using MX Toolbox or whatever. Another cool one that I've recently come across is Bug Herd. So it's like an extension that your client can actually use to basically like look at a web page and then like make comments and almost like a virtual whiteboard, talk about a page, like what they want changed using the page, or create bugs. It does screenshots really well and all that kind of stuff. So if you have a client or whatever, even in your company, you're not getting good information about a bug, you can install this JavaScript package, bug herd, that'll allow people to give you better tickets with screenshots and all that kind of good stuff. The rubber ducky method, I'll just tell a quick story. So when I was doing programming in a fairly large company, I had a big problem with something related to Memcache or something. So I ran up to one of the smartest developers there I knew, and he was the introvert type, but basically he sat there and he was still coding, and I was like, "Hey, I got this question," and he's like, "Okay," and he grabbed this rubber duck that was sitting on top of his monitor, and with one hand he held the duck to my face, and with the other hand he was continuing to code and doing his thing, and he said, explain your problem to the duck." What essentially and then I was like, "Oh, this jerk." But then I started explaining the problem, and it means basically try to simply explain what your issue is. So as you explain your problem in a simple way, most of the time that's when a light bulb goes off to yourself that says, wait a minute, that in there is probably what's causing my issue. So it's basically like explain it like I'm five, sort of mentality of trying to figure out what your problem is. So most of the time you're just attacking the problem from a wrong angle. Again, don't spin your wheels. If you just keep trying to solve it the same way, you're gonna just burn yourself out. So get up, take a walk. And for just junior developers out there, Googling stuff is great, but don't be afraid, that if you do have a team lead, that's what they're there for, is to lead. A good leader should empower their developers to, become, even if they view it, oh, this is a waste of my time, that's a terrible way to lead. They should see it as, once I help this person, they shouldn't need to ask me this question again because they're learning. So understand the solution is what I want to tell junior developers. So don't blindly implement whatever you see on Stack Overflow. And more importantly, don't ask the same question twice. Like, you need to retain that information, and try not to bug somebody on your team with the same question that could frustrate them. So if you use them once, write it down. I heavily use like the Notes app, in Mac and things like that to just throw quick notes into, make use of that stuff. Especially for like Linux commands or whatever CLI stuff, you have something clever that you wrote, save it somewhere. And if you did everything in your humanly power to try to solve a problem and you just hit a dead end, take a break, sleep on it, and let your subconscious work on it. I'm sure some of you out there have had the scenario where you've tried all day to fix something. Like you want to take your laptop and use it as a Frisbee, but you go to sleep and in the middle of the night, you wake up in a cold sweat and you have the answer. That's your subconscious at work. It's a very powerful tool. This screenshot of this guy here is actually from a movie I like. It's a very low budget movie called Pi, P-I. And in the movie, continually, he's like a super smart guy, and he just keeps saying throughout the movie as he's trying to figure out this really hard problem, restate my assumptions. So if you get stuck, you get to the end, you didn't figure it out, restate what you assume is happening and try to come at it at a different angle. So demo time. So we've reached kind of the end here. Let me just check the questions before I move on. Looks like we're good. So cool. So for the demo, I just want to point out that on my GitHub, if you go to github.com, OG Programmer, I've got a couple of repos out there. Vagrant one, I think, is wicked out of date. Docker one probably works. Xdebug example is what I'm going to show you. Xdebug example will show you how to use the native PHP built-in web server and Xdebug installed on your Mac. So like I mentioned with Symfony, we've been having so many slow issues with Docker. We decided to just start running it natively. We've seen a huge boost in page load speeds and things like that. So started shifting some of those heavier projects, if you will. They were taking like almost a minute to load a page sort of thing. I'd recommend taking a look at that if you're using Docker and that's what's causing the issue. So let me go here. Yeah, and here's the Xdebug example repository. Don't mind that it hasn't been updated in 5 years. I actually just pushed a commit to it for the 7.4 update. That just that way you can at least get it working with a Mac and install Xdebug with the PECL install command. So here in the install OSX, there's just this basic bash script that'll install PHP 7.4 and also install Xdebug with PECL. And then here in the example directory is what I'll show you with PHP Storm. So let me move this over here. I gotta get out of full screen. Alrighty. And I'll just throw this over here. Okay, so you want to set up Xdebug, and like I mentioned, you could use this little telephone to just start listening for anything on 9003. But if you do have differences in the class path map settings, or you want to listen for specific keys for the IDE key, you'll want to go here and edit configurations. So in here, you'll see this little plus button here, and there are a ton of different providers that, well, I have IntelliJ here, but it's basically PHP Storm with a few added languages, but there's a whole bunch of different debuggers depending on what language you're in. For this specific Xdebug example, PHP Remote Debug is what we want to select. So in here,
Joshua, it's the resolution is, I don't know if we can change it.
let me,
Or maybe it's just me. Kind of hard. Everything's like hard to read now. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's better. But then, yeah, then we don't have the nav bar.
Yeah, let me get shoots view.
There we go.
Yeah, I'm trying to look for.
And you don't have to go through all the examples. Maybe just kind of a quick overview or something.
Sure. So let me. So let's hit play here. Or actually, I'll just stop the session. Let me go back here. So when you start the Xdebug examples, when you clone down the repo, essentially what you'll need to do is there's a directory for the web project for all these like files for different examples. And I'll show you here. This is what the directory structure looks like. So in the install directory, I've just got a simple way to install Xdebug. And then underneath this web directory here, there's a command to start the built-in PHP web server. Take note that I'm using that Xdebug mode. So you can use a D flag to just set like any INI config when you're running PHP. So here I'm just saying, hey, turn on develop and coverage and debug. Those are the three I want to turn on. And what to serve this out on. So this will be the host and port that the PHP internal web server starts it. So once you run this bash script here, that'll start the web server, and then you can start accessing these by just navigating to your local host. You can see here I added $xdebug session start equals merge PHP, which is what I used for the IDE config. So I'll have to probably get, yeah, here it is here. So if you get to the gear icon, you can change your IDE key to whatever. Like again, if you want to debug multiple requests, you could have, 1 and 2, and then debug those separately at the same time. So we'll want to click the bug to actually start listening on port 9003. Once we do that, make sure you've triggered Xdebug to start by either adding this or using some extension to turn on Xdebug. And then let's just go over the conditional breakpoints, and the rest I'll leave it up to you guys to take a look at. Again, if you have questions, feel free to DM me on Twitter. But the conditional one, I think, is perhaps useful for some of you, even more veteran developers out there. So here's an example where I'm taking a string or taking an array, and I have all these letters that basically make the word hello world, right? And then for each of those letters, I'm putting the string together, right? It's not rocket science here. But what I want to show is, okay, let's say you have a loop that goes through 1,000 values, and on a particular value, a exception happens or some error happens. Well, with a conditional breakpoint, you could stop the breakpoint only when a particular condition is met. So what we could do here is I could right click on the debug breakpoint itself. Here under condition, you can add anything you want, just as you would put into an if statement, what the condition needs to be in order for the breakpoint to actually stop. So let's say we want to stop only when W comes along. So we can put when char is W and hit done. You'll see we're on H right now. This little question mark indicates that it's a conditional breakpoint. If I hit play, it will now loop through and it will check that condition every time. So now if I hit play, boom, it stopped only when char equal W and skipped all these other values here. Which again, if you have some massive loop and you want to stop on something particular, that actually has helped me in some cases. Rather than sitting there and having to sit through and hit play every time it goes through the loop to get to the particular problem that's happening. So there's a bunch of other examples in here. Feel free to look at them. There's one for JavaScript, one that showcases Xdebug stack traces, another that talks about watchers, and of course your classic PHP info method, which, hey, dropping an info file and just seeing what the values are in some remote environment. Don't forget to go and delete the file. It's not the end of the world. So Yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. I appreciate everybody's time. And again, if anybody does have questions that were not covered in this talk, feel free to DM me. Couple of things I just wanted to throw out there. One, the company I run, Remote Dev Force, we're always looking for not only projects to work on, but for talented developers who are looking for freelance work. We do have a lot of Laravel and Symfony development work. So if you are looking for some of that, feel free to reach out to me, josh@remotedevforce.com. I am also giving away free stickers. I've got a few holographic remote dev stickers too that I'm going to be sending out. So jump on Twitter, follow me, and then give me your address, and I'll be happy to send those over to you, especially if you want to give them out at your local in-person meetup or whatnot. And if you're ever out here in Vegas, hit me up. I'll be glad to grab coffee with you. The third Saturday of every month, there's an event called Tech Alley that we have here in the downtown arts district. That's where Vegas PHP has their meetup that I've been hosting. And we do 2 meetups. We have one called Demo Time, where we have everybody showcase what they've been working on. It's a great way for startups and entrepreneurs to get feedback on what they've been working on, as well as our other meetup where we just have more technical talks and do nerd stuff. So again, thanks everyone. I do want to throw it out there. When you guys raffle off prizes, go ahead and throw in. I've got a prize to raffle off, which is a 1-month Symphony Cast membership. symphonycast.com, Ryan Weaver, he's awesome. It's a great way to learn symphony development, and the content's outstanding. And I've got a code that I want to give away for a month that I bought a long time ago, and want to find a happy home for some developer who will use it. So that's it for me. I appreciate everyone's time, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Josh. Real quick,
Yeah, go ahead.
Rod asks if you could quickly show us how to watch a variable, I believe within Xdebug.
Sure. So let me see if I can find so there's a watcher pane that we can add here, but in this presentation mode, I'm having troubles trying to find that. Let me just go here. Surprised that didn't work. So let's try this another way. Let me try to do this watcher example. I think let me get out of presentation mode for a second. Parents, exit. There we go. Okay. So let me go back so you guys can see what I'm doing here. So I'll go to watchers. Enter presentation mode. So under this, they kind of moved it, which is what tripped me up a little bit here. But this plus button right here, if you hit this, you can then add a watcher. So for example, if we want to watch this message variable here, we can hit the plus sign and I can put message, and that will then start this that will then start watching this value, and it basically highlights that value here at the top, so that way you can watch it all the time. So if I go and let's like kick off a Xdebug session for the watcher page. Oh, I think it's already started. So I hit play. There we go. So now I'm here, and as I step through, you can see the watcher here now has something in message. So it just highlights here, hey, this is what this value is. So as the value changes, this will give you a clear way of always kind of seeing what that value is. Because sometimes if you're dealing like let's say this, where there's just like all this data and you're like, whoa, this is like TMI. So for example, we wanted to watch whatever this remote adder, we could just do like server, and it kind of auto populates, which is nice. Remote adder address, right? And then just hit enter and add watch. And now it takes that value in that array and just kind of quickly displays it there. So that's a nice way of even in a class, if you're watching a particular parameter in like a model or a service or whatever, you can quickly highlight it. That way it's clear to debugging and you don't have to dig through every time you start like a new request.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, good question. Cool. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Joshua. Yeah. So I had one question. I have like always like a Logan question, but I have a couple FYIs here for you as well. So what do you find more useful in your like the day-to-day work, like debugging or profiling?
You mean between the two?
Yeah. What's more useful?
By far
overall,
debugging. I mean, 90% is definitely debugging. The only time I'm using a profiler is if something is just like abnormally slow and I want to take a look. Most of the time, again, if you're in like some framework like Symfony or Laravel, going into the toolbar, you'll be able to find like decent stack traces and some level of profiling in there that should point out what's happening. One great question I always ask when I'm interviewing developers is like, you've got a query, how do you know if it's slow? And what I'm wanting to hear is the explain on a query to see if it's doing a full table scan. Most of the time, that's probably what's causing something to be slow. But there could just be bad code, right? It's looping over a bajillion records, not doing something fancy like generators or things like that. So, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the profiling, I seem to do, less profiling than debugging, but I think that it's helpful for everybody to understand kind of in different use cases, and so it's kind of I throw you a softball there. So FYI, here my first FYI is there are nicer cache grind viewers for the Mac App Store if you search for cache grind. And then second FYI is you might consider adding InfluxDB to your graphs and monitoring slide, and check it out if you haven't heard of it before. It's so there's open source. It is open source. I'm pretty sure it is. With an enterprise SaaS offering, it's alternative to Grafana and Prometheus. Yeah, but thank you so much for the talk tonight. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. If you have any other questions, get them in now. I think we'll have an abbreviated hangout tonight. But I'll pass it over to my other panelists here as we wrap things up.
Thanks a lot, Joshua. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joshua.
Yeah, thanks, man. Great talk.
Yeah. Feel free to raffle off that Symphony Cast membership. I don't know how you guys run raffles or whatnot, but if you just send me their email address, I could send that over.
Yeah, sounds good. Maybe we'll do it the start of the next one for next month. That might be good in intro, and we'll figure out those details over Slack.
Sounds good.
So I'm gonna stop the recording, and then here. Yep.